Hi, we continue in Acts 7 today as Stephen's speech at the Sanhedrin moves from Abraham to Joseph and before it gets to Moses. And as you look at the right side of the screen, we've been going over some of these issues that are important in interpreting these chapters. If you haven't watched the introductory video to this unit of Acts 6 and 7, I encourage you to do so, where we go over some of these things in detail, including especially number 4, how the history of biblical scholarship has led to many distortions in reading this chapter, and I'll continue to be pointing out some of those as we go. Where we are now is last time we looked at what kind of speech Stephen gave, and I highlighted how, against scholars who try to focus Stephen's speech in forms of Greco-Roman rhetoric, I highlight how, as a Hellenistic Israelite speaking to other Hellenistic Israelites, he's speaking not from the tradition of Greco-Roman rhetoric, but from the tradition of inner biblical speeches from people like Moses and Joshua and others who have often given the people a summary of their history. And that's, of course, the point of the Bible overall, is to situate a people in a narrative that presents where God is with them in their struggles over time. So it's all inner Jewish stuff, and that goes against the element that somehow that Stephen here represents a bridge between the Jews and the Gentiles. Nothing could be further from the truth here. So we'll also look briefly at the parallels between Stephen's experience and after his speech and that of the Passion of Jesus. We'll see that more in the end. But there are also some subtle parallels in the middle, and we'll see that as we look now at the shape of the passage. As I was highlighting last time, there are no chiastic shapes holding the whole thing together, but there are paragraphs that are focused around certain key words. So we noted last time with Abraham everything about fathers, and he calls his people that he's talking to, the Sanhedrin, men, brothers, and fathers, highlighting a triple patriarchal familiar connection with them. And that's why I highlighted that throughout here, including the language of patriarchs. Joseph referring to his brothers as patriarchs would be very odd. They're not patriarchs to him. But that's the perspective that Stephen is providing the Sanhedrin. And we see in our paragraph today, Egypt, 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 Egypt. And in many ways, the Joseph paragraph here is simply a bridge from the promise to Abraham that in Mesopotamia to go to the land to get them to the Moses situation. But note how so much of the passage, the whole speech, is about the question of land. And one of the elements of that is whether God is with them in places other than Jerusalem, which is all setting up the issue that the Jerusalem temple was never meant to be the sole place where Yahweh is, but simply a place where Yahweh is. But Yahweh could certainly be other places as well as within the community of the way that Stephen's a part of, apart from the Jerusalem temple that will emerge as the Jerusalem temple, led here by the power of the Sanhedrin, increasingly rejects them and begins to persecute them. So our paragraph here is an odd one. The character of Joseph, the son of Jacob, is only mentioned in the New Testament a couple of other times, rarely, as we can see in my note in Hebrews there. I could look at that passage briefly in a litany of who by faith has come to God, and that's a theme of the letter to the Hebrews. So by faith Jacob, by faith Joseph, by faith Moses, etc. Just that one reference. The only other one is to the house of Joseph, or the family of Joseph, amongst the 12 tribes, where there's 12,000 from each, making 144,000 in Revelation, symbolic reassembly of the people of God. But nothing about the actual character of Joseph. That's the only place he is here. And I didn't notice this last time as Stephen was telling the story very selectively about Abraham to the Sanhedrin. Obviously, the Sanhedrin know the story. At one level, the whole action here is incredibly arrogant to think that this Stephen, who, although filled with grace and wisdom and the power of the Spirit, is apparently in terms of status a nobody, at least compared to the Sanhedrin, is schooling them. It's like some law student, or maybe even just an ordinary person, trying to teach the Supreme Court something about the history of law. And yet they seem to listen to him. They don't interrupt him at all. And in the end, it's not explicitly the Sanhedrin that goes after him, but seemingly the crowd. We'll see that when we get there. So they know the story, and they know what he's leaving out. And if we're good biblical readers, we do too. If you're not as familiar, I'll try to point out some of the elements here. But we'll see how much of the story is left out, and they must be aware of that and be thinking about it, because here, much of what's left out will indict them, whether vis-a-vis Stephen, whether vis-a-vis Jesus, or whether vis-a-vis the whole element of the 7 opposed by the synagogue of the freedmen because of their jealousy of the alternative banking system. We'll have to see as we go. So let's begin to jump right into our section here. As my note below has on the section, Fitzmyer suggests that Joseph is portrayed as a type of Jesus, but maybe here, only partly, only a little bit here. As my note below has, highlighting what I was just saying, Stephen's speech omits all the nastiness among them, that is, among Joseph and his brothers, including the rape of Dinah from Genesis 34, that's curiously linked here, and as we'll see in verse 16. So the patriarchs here, isn't that an interesting way? Always referred to in Genesis, of course, as the brothers, but here as the patriarchs. Walton suggests here below that Stephen, as Joseph suffered at the hands of his brothers, so will Stephen suffer at the hands of those he addresses as brothers. And yet they are not called brothers here, but fathers. That's the interesting point. Stephen addresses the Sanhedrin as brothers and fathers, but here Joseph's brothers, which would fit very well if it was his brothers treated him badly or were jealous of him, as one could then infer the Sanhedrin are jealous of Stephen and of Jesus, but he chooses not to use that language. It's an interesting little piece there. The word for jealous here, zelo or zelao, is the verb, and here it is a verb in that form. We see the noun form jealousy in 1345 is very relevant here. It's a kind of jealousy that can also be translated as desire, so not necessarily in the sense of envy, but in the sense of wanting something. Notice it's parallel in a way to how the Judaioi, called Jews, will be jealous later. Let's look at it of Paul here in 17:5. With the help of some ruffians in the marketplace, this is in Athens, they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. But here, the issue is not the question of a temple. The question is, we won't look at the whole context here, is elements of what reputation they're getting in the crowd. And Stephen is certainly not getting any reputation in the crowd, and neither was Joseph. So it's jealous for a different reason. We can also see the only other use of it, and notice it's, as my note further down below says, only in Paul elsewhere in the New Testament, with one exception of James, and there in 1st and 2nd Corinthians and a little bit in Galatians. But if we look at the other element here in Acts, we see, again, when the Judai saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy. And that's a sense that they're less popular. The issue is the fame rather than the economic element that we'll see here. And the element in the story of Joseph, which isn't named, was the fatherly favor. That Jacob had given him the special coat, wrongly understood as the coat of many colors, more likely the long sleeve coat. If you want to know more about that, you can watch my Genesis series here at Radical Bible. But the reason for their jealousy is left out. But again, the Sanhedrin know the answer. Would Luke's audience know the answer? Does Luke assume that his audience knows the Hebrew Bible in the Septuagint form? Hard to know, but certainly within the story, they know the reason for that. And it's not sold. This is just wrong in the Hebrew, or in the Greek rather. I don't want to highlight that because what it leaves out by translating the same word here as sold and then later as enabled here, it omits the great contrast that the patriarchs gave him into Egypt, but God gave him grace and wisdom. And that's the contrast here. So we miss that completely here. So they gave him into Egypt, but God was with him. And Genesis certainly says that, but note that's the only mention of God in this section. The rest of this is just people doing things. And it's all seeming very neutral. You'd never know all the tension that was in the story, other than the one little element that we'll see momentarily here. So we have Joseph in Egypt. We hear nothing about what happened, nothing about the dreams, nothing about the baker and the cupbearer and the dungeon and Potiphar and Mrs. Potiphar and any of all that stuff. It jumps right to, and God rescued him. Exalato here, and it's the first of the several uses we'll see in Acts, we see a number of times. It's only in Matthew, elsewhere in the Gospels, and once in Galatians. But it does echo Genesis 37:21. The word for afflictions is important here because it doesn't have to mean afflictions. The noun form is slipsis, which can mean suffering or pressure in that sense. And we see it elsewhere in other places. Notice in the next verse here, we see it as suffering here, and yet it's the same word. So we'll need to see that how both of those play out, but it also plays out later. And notice here it plays out in 11:19, directly connected to our immediate passage. Now those who were scattered because of the slipsis that took place over Stephen. And so it's there described as persecution. Here is affliction, and here is suffering. But the root meaning of the word is pressure, and the pressure was on Joseph, if we know the story, of course, to conform to Pharaoh, much as the pressure is on Congress of the United States to conform to Trump, for almost exactly the same reasons, because there's power amongst the person at the top to cause great harm to somebody if you don't go along with him. So that he's not suffering in that sense, but he is under pressure. And enabled to win favor and show wisdom covers over completely that it's straightforward. The passive voice here is not what's in the Greek. Gave him grace and wisdom. And we already heard, of course, that's exactly what Stephen has. We heard in 6:8 that he has grace, and we also saw in 6:3 and in 6:10 that he has wisdom. So it's certainly showing in that sense that Joseph is similar to Stephen, although Stephen has no relationship with patriarchs, etc. And now he's before Pharaoh. The stood is also not in the Greek here, to show wisdom before Pharaoh. Perhaps much like Stephen has been given grace and wisdom to show before the Sanhedrin. And the idea that Pharaoh and the Sanhedrin are being made parallel here would certainly rail against the Sanhedrin. As my note below has one of the older perspectives here from, although it's from Keener, not an older note. He says, Joseph, like Stephen and some other Hellenistic Jewish proclaimers in Acts, was persecuted by his brothers, yet secured a hearing among Gentiles such as Pharaoh. But Stephen does not have any hearing among Gentiles at all. His only hearing is here, and it's before the Sanhedrin. So there are no Gentiles anywhere in the scene here. So although Keener is very precise in his work, that seems to me that's simply wrong. That's part of the old Jewish to Christian line. Stephen is never shown talking to Gentiles. Then it continues that Pharaoh appointed him ruler here, recalling Stephen's own appointment in 6:3. But here the analogy breaks down. If Jesus is the one of whom others are jealous, it is God, not Herod or Caesar, who raises him up as king. And if it's Stephen here, there's certainly no divine appointment of Stephen other than being one of the seven, which is certainly not to be a ruler over anybody. It's exact opposite, as we'll see in a moment when we look at the comparison of the famine recalled in verse 11 from Genesis and the famine that will take place later in Acts. So let's look at that right now. Let's just jump right to it. And we move into Genesis 41 here as he continues. And notice as it gets to the famine, there's nothing about Joseph proposing to Joseph how to manage famine for profit or any of that stuff. Nothing about the Egyptian wives or the Egyptian children. Simply the statement of famine from Jacob's perspective here. And so here's the famine, and although it isn't named here, it simply says Jacob went down for food. It says nothing about whether they got food. But if we know the story as the Sanhedrin does, we know that Joseph messed with them. He lied to them. He put their money back in the sack. He accused them of being spies. He manipulated them every which way until they brought Benjamin back, and their father thought that Joseph was dead, etc. So all that stuff is left out. And what he ultimately did, as I was just naming, was to manage the famine for profit, to store it all up and then sell it back to people at the cost of everything, as we see in Genesis 47 in all too great detail. So let's look briefly at the famine here in Acts 11:28 and see the difference. One of them, named Agabus, we don't need to worry about who he is at the moment, stood up and predicted by the Spirit that there would be a severe famine all over the world that would take place during the reign of Claudius. And here's their response. The disciples determined that according to their ability, each would send relief to the believers living in Judea. This they did, sending it by the elders Barnabas and Saul. And it's the kind of thing you hear Paul proclaim in his letters, that they should be sharing with their brothers and sisters, even if they've never met him, which is, as I would call it, the religion of creation response, an alternative to Joseph, religion of empire response, which is to say there is enough food, it just needs to be shared. They don't sell it to people, they just provide what they need, which has been what we've seen since the end of chapter 2 and the end of chapter 4 in the summaries there. So that's implicit here, that the way Joseph manages the famine is to make profit for the elite and to make everybody else slaves. And that little implication will be held in abeyance until we get to chapter 11. So there was the famine throughout Egypt and Canaan and great thlipsis, as we saw, and our fathers could find no food. And the word for food, kortasmata, here is an unusual one. It's in the Genesis story, but only for animal fodder, for donkey fodder. So I didn't know how to translate that in a word. I certainly wouldn't say our ancestors found no fodder, but it's really like animal food. It's people in desperate situations, going even more desperate than the Genesis narrative. But when Jacob heard there was grain in Egypt, how has he heard that? We don't know. He leaves out all the chicanery on Joseph's part. He sent our fathers there on their at first. There's no word for visit in either situation here. As Luke Johnson notes below, unique to Luke and important for the structuring of the story, since it corresponds both to the twofold visitation of Moses and of Jesus in his ministry and through his prophetic successors. And that may be the case, but no distinction is made here between Joseph's behavior on the first and second one. Nothing is said about the first one at all. It's just that he sent them there at first, and at the second, Joseph made himself known to his brothers. Again, as my note has, omitting all the questions of Joseph's ID, no divine attribution for the second visit at all. Interestingly, here, the New RSV has made himself known and became known as if they're the same word, but they are not. So let's look a little more closely. The word for made himself known, anegrizo, here is only here in the Greek Bible, but it's close to what we see in Genesis 45 as recognized. but Joseph's family became known, or literally became visible. Pharaoh Egeneto became visible to Pharaoh. But how is that? Nothing of his lies or why he weren't visible is stated there. So amazingly, all the exciting stuff is left out. It seems as if the only purpose is to get the family to Egypt. And that's what happens here. So Joseph sent, apostolo here, 24 times in Acts and 3 times in our scene, literally the meaning of apostle, the one to be sent, and invited, which is a little misleading here. The word metakaleo here, which is not elsewhere in the New Testament, but 4 times in Acts, means to cause someone to go from one place to another. So it's not just a general invitation, as we can see in the other examples I won't show you now. It's inviting someone specifically to go from one place to another. So he calls his father and all his family, and we see the word for that, sungenion, here only in 7:3 earlier, elsewhere in Acts, about Abraham leaving his family. So now Joseph brings all his family, 75 in all, following the Septuagint, but not the Hebrew Scripture, which has 70 there. And Luke follows the Septuagint all along, as presumably his Greek reading audience does as well. So Jacob went down to Egypt. Curiously, it doesn't note that the brothers, or described here as the patriarchs, went down to Egypt, but they're included in the rest of the verse. And again, nothing about the reunion, nothing about the emotion of it. It's as if it's the Cliff Notes version of this. And the fact that it's said in such a flat tone that it leaves out all the powerful emotion certainly must be left for the Sanhedrin to read between the lines. That Stephen doesn't have to say all that. They know all too well what he's leaving out. Now, he himself died there, as well as our fathers. And then we have a very interesting verse. And despite all of scholarly attempts to unravel it and give a reason, there is no particular reason, but it's plainly an intentional weaving together of 2 different situations here. The burial at Machpelah in the land that Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite is described in Genesis 23:16-20, and that bought by Jacob from the sons of Hamor at Shechem, described in Genesis 33:19. Jacob was buried at Machpelah with the rest of his family, but Joseph in the second, as we hear at the end of Joseph. The Septuagint of Genesis 49:30, without getting in all the Greek here, has the cave, the double, the one opposite Mamre. So Shechem here can't be blamed on the Septuagint. It has to mean that Stephen is intentionally mixing them up to bring up the implied but unstated rape of Dinah there. And that's part of it. Let's look more closely at the verse. Bodies is not in the Greek here at all. So our fathers were brought back to Shechem. And there's another wordplay that's lost here, using the word metatithemi, but the word for laid is almost the same word. So we see in the form here, metatithyson and etithyson here. So I couldn't come up with an English way to make brought back and laid parallel there, but you can see in the Greek they are. So as they were brought back to Shechem and put in the tomb that Abraham had bought, which is just wrong. Stephen must know it's wrong. The Sanhedrin know it's wrong, but it's a detail that won't come up in their conversation. Shechem itself is in Samaria, excuse my typo below, near Mount Gerizim and its temple, and so perhaps that's the reason that it's being mentioned here, to suggest that our bodies are buried in the very place that's the antithesis of Jerusalem throughout from Josiah on. Before that, really, according to the sins of Jeroboam, according to the authors of the Deuteronomistic history. But I bring up Josiah because it's in 2 Kings 23 that he attacks Shechem and kills the priests that are there, even though they were worshiping Yahweh and their sin was being not in the right place, which of course is Jerusalem. So that mention of Shechem here may certainly be a reason to bring that up here. It led many older scholars to suggest a Samaritan providence for the whole Stephen story, but there's nothing really to support that. It's certainly more likely to be the case that it brings up the rape of Dinah, but also the temple at Mount Gerizim. And they bought it for a sum of silver, using an unusual phrase here, timis argurion, and argurio is silver, but timis is usually translated as honor, but a camnein proceeds, precisely as what we heard in the sharing of resources. So whereas there are shares of resources there, here's a purchase. And we'll stop there because that's the end of our paragraph as it begins to shift toward Moses. And so the Joseph story has gotten the Israelites into Egypt, where they will confront Egypt but not trust Moses to lead them out. And that's one of the key elements that we'll deal with next time. See you then for that. Bye-bye.